Hopefully we'll be joined by a few more participants as we go, and then the session is also going to be recorded, so you can share the link with colleagues going forward. So this is our rescheduled second webinar in our Capital Markets webinar series, and we're really excited here to have a range of presenters talking to us about their practical experiences of how market analysis has been used to inform program design. And so taking some of the theory that we talked about in the first markets webinar and thinking about what that means in practice. Just a few practicalities before we get started. So if you're not familiar with the Adobe platform, just a couple of things to point out. So there's the chat box down below here, chatting. There is your microphone function, which is the second icon on the top. And if you want to check whether your microphone works, you can press on the meeting button top left and go through an audio setup with it. We also want to make this session as interactive as possible. So we're going to be using some polls. So I really encourage you to fill those in. So they'll be coming up shortly. And then some of our presenters will also be asking you if you agree or disagree with certain statements. And so to do that, if you look again on the top row, the third button along is you can see a little person with a raised hand. So you can use that whenever you'd like to make a contribution, and we really encourage you to speak rather than use the chat box if you can. But then you'll see that underneath that, if you click on the little down arrow, there's an agree button. I'm just testing it there, you can see, or disagree. So we'll be using those functions during the course of the presentation as well. So please, as you go, so either you can raise your hand or do type some questions into the chat box, and we'll be referring back to those either at the end of specific presentations or at the end of the whole webinar. So just some questions to kind of keep in mind as we're going. So some of the framing questions we thought about were, where have you seen good examples of market analysis being incorporated into response analysis? And what are some of the blockages and enablers that you've encountered to really effectively using market analysis in response analysis? So hopefully you've got some practical experiences to share as well. So I'll carry on here with a little, what I've called I'll do the agenda first and then a little virtual introduction. So in terms of the agenda, so yeah, we're going to get to know each other a little bit more through the poll, understand who's in the room and what your experiences are. Then talk a little bit about why market analysis is such an important component of response analysis and why we're focusing specifically on this within this webinar. Then I'm going to hand over to colleagues from, to William Martin from CRS, who's going to share some lessons learned on response analysis that have been compiled by CRS across different contexts, different sectors and objectives. Then we'll go a bit more in depth into how market analysis has been used to inform programming decisions. And this is going to be presented by Emily Sloan from IRC. And then making this even more practical to think about some real case studies of, so we're going to look at Niger, South Sudan, and Nigeria, looking at how market monitoring data is being used to inform response analysis on an ongoing basis, at multimodal programming in South Sudan. So market analysis isn't just about cash or choosing between cash, vouchers, and in kind. It should allow us to have that flexibility between modalities. And then handing over to Alison Hemberger from Mercy Corps, who's going to present to us Mercy Corps' experiences of designing market-based early recovery programs in northeast Nigeria. And then there'll be plenty of space for discussion as well afterwards. So just a little bit of a virtual introduction, as I mentioned. So the first markets webinar, which was, I think, back in March, actually, which some of you may have attended, there was quite a lot of theory. It was about thinking about market-based programming generally and using the market-based programming framework, which was developed by the Markets in Crisis Group, as an entry point for understanding market, how interventions that work through, that use or that support the market. Then we talked about the minimum standard for market analysis, which CALP developed as a companion guide to Sphere, and how that can be used in practice to support different market analysis exercises. We also had a presentation by Oxfam about their Markets Compass, which helps determine which market tool might be appropriate to conduct analysis in different settings, as well as a presentation of IRC's Market Information Framework, which I know that Emily will be referring to again throughout her presentation today, and which helps you understand what types of data you need to answer which questions. So all that was great, but it was quite theoretical. And at the end of that webinar, what we did is we did a poll, and we asked you to select from a number of options what you would like us to go into more depth in a next webinar. And that's where we are today, because the preferences that came out were for response analysis, and then content on experiences of the implementation of market-based programming. So what we decided is to prioritize response analysis this time, and then for our future webinars, our next webinar, we think we're going to focus on monitoring of market-based interventions, and particularly of market support interventions. So yes, and the reason we're focusing on response analysis, I mean, just so that everyone's on the same page, so response analysis is using evidence to make decisions about what type of response to implement, and it includes elements of appropriateness and feasibility. And as you will all know, there's many different ways of conducting response analysis. It's an iterative process, but that's the overall approach. And so when we look, and then market analysis is using market-based evidence to make decisions about what type of response to implement and or how to adapt existing programming. So it's a component, a really critical component of response analysis, but response analysis is broader. So, and we'll be revisiting these concepts throughout the next hour or so, of course. So just to get a sense of who's in the room then, we're now going to do a couple of polls. So, Rose, if you could kindly bring up the first poll. The question there is about how many years experience you have in market-based programming. So, oh, maybe I can bring that open. Okay, let's open it. Rose, could you bring it over to the screen, please? Can people see it on the screen? I'm not sure, actually. Can someone say if they can see it? Just okay. Right. I'm hoping that Rose will be able to. Sorry, Isabel, can you say? Sorry, Rose, could you please, we need you for the polls, so could you please share poll number 9, which is the how many years experience do you have in market-based programming? Sorry, just. William, can you go ahead? Yeah.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. So my name is William Martin, and I'm the technical advisor for cash and market at the CRS Humanitarian Response Department. And I would like to present today quickly on, sorry. I would like to present today, sorry Isabel, I think you have the wrong presentation. Sorry. On understanding the response analysis within CRS country program. So yeah. So we'll look today at our why this research, the research question, the key results, and the recommendation we are looking into. So we did an internal research, and like CRS invested heavily in increasing our markets and cash-based programming over the past 5 years. Is there an issue? I don't see anything on this screen anymore.
Oh, sorry. Okay, gosh, we're doomed for this. Right. Rose, we'll look at the polls afterwards. Is this okay? This is you've got the right slides, William?
I don't think so, because I think mine is supposed to be followed by the World Vision case study, but I can present on that as well.
Okay.
All right. It's regarding the response analysis anyway, so we're good. So, can we come back? So I don't have access anymore to my slides.
Okay. You should still be able to go back and forth.
Yeah, no, I don't have access to
it.
Okay.
I'll go.
Oh yeah, so you'll have to push the button. Sorry everyone for the technical issues. So the past 5 years, we increased our cash programming over like 50 countries, and our motto is implementing cash everywhere, wherever it's appropriate to best meet people need. And to start to quantify what appropriate means, and to understand how we are doing that response analysis, and to be able to improve toward our goal, we did a quick research on the response analysis and what were the rationale behind it within our programming. If you can move to the next slide, please. So we compared 11 country programs from CRS, and we did a review and interviews of these programs, and to see what factors contributed to modality choice, and analyze when CRS was and was not able to implement the most appropriate response to meet people needs. So there were some selection bias in the selection of the country program, but we thought it was useful to present the results. If you can move to the next slide, please.
Yeah, you should be able to do it as well, William.
Yeah, I can. Sorry. So the CRS has committed to the World Humanitarian Summit in the Copenhagen. We are committed, on preparedness and the ability to start cash transfer programming where appropriate quickly, for better response analysis as well, to scale up cash whenever it's appropriate, and to do more localized response as well, and work through local actors, and for better coordination and collaborations. The research questions for these studies were: how should CRS define appropriate and feasible? What is the frequency and context of CRS country program modality usage? What is the frequency with which the most appropriate response is chosen in CRS program? What is the frequency of cash underutilization in CRS program? What factors are most influential in country programs response analysis? Does CRS use the result of market assessment appropriately? What challenges does CRS face in identifying the most appropriate response, and what are the best practices? So you will see the results, and again, there is some bias. It's probably, we saw the worst of the research of the response analysis, but we thought it was interesting. So some factors contribute heavily to modality choice in CRS when we asked the respondent, and I will stop particularly on some of them. The security was dominant, the choice of the response we got.
Please mute yourself. Excuse me, please mute yourself if you're not speaking. Thanks. So Adolfo and Blake and others, please mute yourselves. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. The security is mentioned a lot by our respondents. However, there's a lack of objectivity regarding how to measure and manage security risk. So CRS staff member, for example, put it like, I'm an outside advisor, so if someone raised a security flag, I'm not going to tell them that they are wrong or push back, but I would love to have a more objective measure of risks. Both market and in-country staff mentioned that security measures should be included in assessment, but individuals could not agree to what extent they would be factoring. That's pretty interesting. What was mentioned a lot as well was the organizational capacity by 80% of our respondents. They mentioned the importance of having a team knowledgeable in market-based intervention. It's interesting because the country's program where staff retention was highest, that's where they tended to implement programs that were considered successful by internal staff and donors alike. That's where they utilized the most appropriate modality available. So it doesn't mean that you need to always have your staff staying in country. You can hire this capacity and have search team as well that could be quite effective. But it's important to note that program may be less likely to use an appropriate cash-based response if they are not sure they will be able to implement it in the future. And another one is the historical default response. So it's very easy that people tend to use response they used in the past, whatever the result of the response analysis in a given context later, they tend to come back to what they did before. If we look at the frequency of choosing most appropriate response options, we see here that 6 out of 11 programs haven't chosen the most appropriate response. That means, for example, CRS didn't use unconditional cash, but probably should have, or maybe not at the right time, or they should have switched more quickly to another modality. 3 out of 11 did the appropriate response choice, and 2 out of 11 did the mostly appropriate choice. For example, for Haiti and Nepal, typically the error was at the timing. In the midst of a rapidly evolving crisis, CRS respondents did not switch as quickly as they would have to the most appropriate modality. So the barriers to choosing the most appropriate option, the most significant barrier cited in 4 of these programs was a tendency to default to a historical precedent. So a modality that had been used much in the past and was most familiar to the actor, whether the country program or local government operating in this context. And then it was tied for second, like individual personalities and organizational capacity, each accounting for 3 programs. And the least influential reasons were security and the local government. So it was interesting because security was mentioned a lot. by the respondent as something to consider, but when you come to like the barriers, they are the least influential reason for picking a modality. So the recommendations we are working on is to continue to focus on preparedness, focus on distribution timing, develop a tool to help choose between cash and vouchers, think objectively about security risks, document and share lessons learned, invest in better linking with development programs, and continue to invest in organizational capacity. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, William. So it'll be interesting to hear from various participants on the line, maybe even in the chat box, whether you faced similar barriers, and whether this issue of organizational capacity is one that you think is a major obstacle. And I think that will be a neat segue into Emily's presentation next, where she'll be talking about the investment that IRC have made specifically in market analysis capacity and what changes have resulted from that. So I'm now going to prompt Rose to do the polls again. Let's hope it will work this time. So hopefully you should see one now on the screen. So the idea is that you just need to fill it in, please. So just click, you'll see the question is, how many years experience do you have in market-based programming? And you can say less than 1, 1 to 3, 4 to 6, or 7 or more. So yeah, if we can open that, Rose, and then people can complete it. Great. Okay. Let's broadcast that one. Get a little bit of an idea of trends. And in the meantime, if we can activate the second one, and the question in the second one is to get a bit of a sense of where you guys are all based. So it is yes, it's to understand what your roles are. So are you based in a field office or country office? What type of organizations you work for? Sorry, regional office or headquarters. So again, fill that in. Okay, great. Let's broadcast that one as well. Rose, please. And then next question is, what type of organization do you work for? And the options that we've got here are NGO, UN, donor, or other. Or maybe we haven't got, yeah, we've got other as well as an option. So if we can open that one, Rose. Oh, some very clear trends emerging. Okay, and then the final question, just to get a sense of kind of continuity, is whether or not you attended CALP's last markets webinar. So that's a yes or no question. Okay, so what I'm seeing emerging from the trends so far is quite interesting, because what we're seeing is that the level of experience of market-based programming is relatively high. 4 to 6 years is definitely the predominant there. or 1 to 3. Like, you know, definitely lots of experience on the line, which is great because we'll have hopefully lots to share. The ratio of headquarter to region or field is very skewed. So I think there's you know, that is indicative of a lot of you being in advisory capacity, supporting country programs, thinking about new approaches, etc. But it's an interesting challenge for us at CALP to be thinking, okay, well, how do we make sure that our webinars and all this experience is reaching field-based staff as well? So your ideas on that would be very welcome. Maybe we can revisit that at the end of the webinar. And also very NGO dominated. That's perhaps not surprising. Yeah, maybe NGOs are, you know, in a position to be able to innovate on market-based programming, perhaps more than other actors. So that's great to see. And then not many of you were at the last markets webinar, and perhaps that's understandable as well, given the subject is quite different, and this is really going into a lot more practical depth. But that's good to see we're reaching a range of people, but also we need to think about that in terms of continuity. So I hope that's useful for my fellow presenters to understand a little bit who they're engaging with. And that's really useful information for us. So thanks, Rose. If you can hide the polls, that would be great. And then I'm going to hand over to Emily. So as I mentioned, IRC have invested quite heavily in their markets capacity, and market analysis is accepted as best practice. Well, more generally, I mean, at IRC more generally, but there are still gaps. So Emily's going to help us explore why there is that gap between theory and practice, and what are some lessons for practitioners. So over to you, Emily.
Great, thanks, Isabel. So hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So as Isabel mentioned at the beginning, response analysis is a bit broader than market analysis per se. But for the purposes of my presentation, I'm really focused on the market-related information portion of response analysis. So as Isabel said, at IRC we're currently doing some research and implementing a project that's really focused on making sure that markets are considered during response analysis. So while Isabel's correct in that we are looking internally at how we can improve our own practice in this, the project that I'm talking about today is actually sort of globally focused. So it's drawing lessons and trying to generate some insight that can benefit the entire community of practice rather than just IRC. So we're going to start with a little bit of an exercise. So we're going to do an agree or disagree exercise where I'll give you a few statements, and you can use our little interactive features to let me know if you agree or disagree based on your own experience. So let's practice just to make sure we all understand how the technology works. So as Isabel mentioned, at the top left of the screen, you should see a picture of somebody raising their arm. So if you click on the arrow next to that, there should be a drop-down menu, and the second and third items in there are agree and disagree. So could everyone just currently click either the agree or disagree button? All right, I'm seeing some agrees and some disagrees. Excellent. Okay, so most of you have a handle on how that works. Okay, great. So I'm going to give you a statement, and just click the appropriate button to let me know if you agree or disagree with that based on your own experience.
Oh, Emily, oh no, it's working. Great.
Okay. So the first statement is, in the past 1 to 2 years, there has been increasing pressure from donors and coordination bodies to conduct market analysis. So I'm seeing all agrees at the moment. Okay, so no one disagrees with that statement. Okay, next one. In the past 12 months, staff in my agency have increasingly gathered information about local markets before designing an emergency response. Okay, again, I'm seeing all agrees. Oh, one disagree. So either people don't want to appear like they're not doing market analysis, or really people are doing more market analysis. And then the third and final one. In the past 12 months, the information that my agency has gathered about markets during market assessments and or market monitoring has not been used to help shape programming. So we're doing market analysis, we're gathering market information, but we're not actually using it to help shape programming. Okay, so I'm seeing a mixture there, but mostly disagree, I would say. Okay, so what I'm gathering from this is that most of you are seeing an increasing trend towards the norm that we should be doing market analysis, and that we not only is this sort of a norm and an expectation, but it's actually translating into practice. And for the most part, we are using the information that we're gathering to inform our program design. So that's all very positive. So let me step back and tell you a little bit about the genesis of the project that we're working on at IRC. So IRC has implemented a whole series of USAID OFTA-funded grants that are looking at developing and promoting good practice in market analysis. So many of you will be familiar with this. We helped to design the EMMA toolkit. More recently, we helped to design and then revise the PCMA pre-crisis market analysis guidance document. So these are all outputs of these USAID OFTA projects. And what we've sort of observed, and this is both personal observation from my own experience, but also from broader research that we've done, is that market analysis is generally now accepted as a best practice. There's no question about that. But gaps in practice still remain. So for example, part of the evidence for that was a 2014 report that we did that reviewed about 40 EMMA studies that had been done, that found that only 58% of the EMMAs that had been done had actually informed program design, which meant that more than 40% of those EMMAs, and anyone who's ever done an EMMA knows that it can be quite a resource-intensive exercise, means that over 40% of those EMMAs had not actually informed programming. So the result is obviously, to some extent, a waste of resources. So we're using, we're spending money, staff time, and consultancies on market assessments, but they're not actually translating into any practice. And then the other result is that we're potentially, our programming may have negative impacts on local economies. Because if we're not doing market-informed programming, that's always the risk. And of course, we're missing the opportunity to do things better. So for the current project that we're doing, because we are continuing this series of projects, we're stepping away from these toolkits and the trainings that we've done in the past, and we're really trying to get to the bottom of why there's this gap between theory and practice. So here are some of our main findings on this, and I'm very interested in other people's perceptions, so feel free to contact me outside of this if you have other insight. But one is that there's a perception that market assessments have to be resource-heavy, standalone activities. And very often this is actually borne out in practice. So we assemble very large teams, we combine them with the training, we bring in specialist leaders from out of the country. We require staff to be available for 2 to 3 weeks to do an assessment. And so while people are happy they get a certificate out of this experience, and it can be a valuable experience for the people who engage the whole time, it's not extremely realistic given the burden that many humanitarian staff that it represents for many humanitarian staff. So it's a bit unrealistic to expect to be able to do something like this every time we need market information. Also, there's a lack of ownership of field-based staff. So because of this tendency to rely on leaders from outside who are quote-unquote specialists in these approaches, field staff feel like they're data collectors, but they're not really empowered to understand and use the information, and they don't always come away feeling like they could repeat this kind of exercise themselves. And furthermore, they're not always the decision makers. So there's the structures of the organization don't allow them necessarily to feel like they can take this information and make decisions based on it. And then finally, we heard this again and again, that people are not always sure why they're doing the market assessment in really concrete terms, and even if they do know why they're doing the assessment, how the data that they're gathering actually connects to the decisions that need to be made. So in many cases you see people are gathering too much data, not enough data, and they're not sure how to connect the dots between the decisions and the actual information. So the project we're doing, apologies for the little blurb on the slide there, but it's called Improving the Uptake of Humanitarian Market Analysis, and essentially the main activities, which are in the circles below, are designed to tackle the reasons for the gap between theory and practice that I've just outlined. So I'll speak about two of the main activities in this project today. So the first is a market information framework that some of you may be familiar with already, and it's designed to spell out why we're doing market analysis in the first place in humanitarian contexts, and connecting key programming decisions with specific market information that's needed to make each of those decisions. And then the second is research into strategies for effectively gathering and using market information in humanitarian programming. So as I said, I'll talk about each of these briefly. So the first is the market information framework. So there's a version 1 of this that's currently circulating. And then these bubbles on this page sum up the key programmatic decisions that we identified in the process of putting this together. So really, they're quite straightforward. So to a large extent, they're about modality choice and appropriateness, and to another extent, they're about the need for market support interventions and the type of market support interventions. So you see, does the market have the capacity to deliver part or all of the needed assistance, and does the market need support in order to be able to supply the key goods identified to crisis-affected people? So these should be familiar with most of you. And then later in programming, so as you're getting into the, you're actually designing a concrete program, you've decided that cash is appropriate, which payment mechanism should be used to deliver cash to crisis-affected people, and what's an appropriate value and frequency of transfer. And then throughout programming, are the modality, value, and frequency, as well as payment mechanism still appropriate? So should be fairly straightforward to anyone who's been involved with cash programming. And obviously this is really focused on a certain type of intervention, but I would argue that most of the humanitarian market analysis tools that are out there are really focused on these main questions. But just as an aside, the reason we're doing this market information framework in a couple of versions is so that we can get some feedback from people who have used it. So if you are interested, if you have thoughts on this, please do get in touch after the webinar. Okay, one more agree or disagree statement. Now you guys are experts on how to use those buttons. So I or a colleague I have worked with closely, excuse me, let me get that up on the screen. I or a colleague I have worked with closely has successfully used market-related data to help design new emergency programming or modify existing programming. So please let me know. We've got a few agrees, a couple of disagrees. Okay, I'd say most of you agree with that, and a few have not had that kind of experience. So if you agree with this, please remember the case or one of the cases that you were thinking about, because we may ask you to tell us more about it during the discussion session a little bit later. So we commissioned, and I see Helen is on the line. So Helen has actually been one of the leading forces in getting this project moving. But we commissioned a rapid review of documents and case studies to identify cases where market information was actually used to inform programming. So we said there's lots of examples of not so good practice, but where this has worked out, what were agencies doing? Is there something we can learn from that that might be useful for other agencies? So this in a nutshell is the 11 practices identified, and the goal is to see if there's anything we can, as I said, anything if we can learn from these examples that could be applied elsewhere. Not saying that these will always work in all contexts, but to inspire some creative thought. So obviously we're not going to go through all of them now, but I'll go through a few of them and share some of the good practices that we found from different agencies. So for the first one is data is collected from a range of market actors, including consumers within the market system. So one example of this is that CRS in Turkey included in their market analysis not only interviews with traders, but also interviews with households who told them which were their preferred markets to purchase basic needs items at. And this seems like such a basic thing, but it's often not done. And CRS actually was surprised that in many cases households were willing and actually preferred to go to larger markets that were farther away from themselves to obtain a wider range of items or better quality items. So whereas they were originally planning to do voucher programs only using very local vendors, they ended up including vendors who were in these farther markets because that's what the households wanted. So again, a very straightforward example that illustrates a good practice that we should all be doing. Another example is market assessments and monitoring are outsourced to the private sector or specialized service providers. So to some extent we're seeing an increase in this where we have agencies such as ACAPS and FuseNet that are gathering large data sets or even WFP that can be shared widely, and then humanitarian actors can use that data as necessary. So obviously this can help us to avoid data collection in the first place, or just to hone our data collection so that we're filling in gaps rather than feeling like we have to do everything ourselves. So one good example comes from Save the Children in the Philippines during the Haiyan response, where Save determined that the data that ACAPS had compiled on markets was sufficient to support a response analysis process. And in the end, they decided they didn't need to do a market assessment at all. So that obviously saved them a lot of time. And that was a legitimate decision in that context. Couple more quick ones. So adaptive management, we all know is a good practice to ensure the program team is able and willing to adapt the response option based on market assessment and market monitoring information. So we probably all have different examples of how this has happened, but one slightly different example with a different angle is from Food for Peace, which provides implementation partners with the option to switch response modalities mid-program by including modality flexibility in contracts. So whereas that can be a big enabling factor to allow adaptive management, whereas many agencies have probably run into that as a blockage when donors are not flexible on modality choice midway through the program. Okay, one more example. The responsibility for market assessment is delegated to non-program related organizational departments at field level. So this is obviously not necessarily going to work in all contexts, but the idea here is that since we have such segmented roles, and often market analyses are led by program people, whereas the people who actually make the decisions about procurement are often supply chain or logistics people. So if these two processes are done separately, you have this case where program people might be recommending a cash-based response, and logistics supply chain people may be recommending an in-kind response, and because they ultimately make the decision, that's what prevails. So a couple of different agencies, CRS and the Red Cross, are looking into actually giving logistics a leading role or a larger role in conducting market analyses in the first place. And the Red Cross has recently developed a logistics competency framework that requires all logisticians to have a certain understanding of markets depending on their level. And officially the log team is now the lead for market analyses with support from the relief team. So we haven't followed up since the initial interview we did with them to see how that's panning out, but we thought that was an interesting model. So that gives you a very quick overview of the research that we're doing, and I wanted to very quickly say what next. So we commissioned this desk review essentially, and then the idea is we have identified 11 best practices. We were going to select a couple of these that seemed to have very interesting potential and then develop them further through a small series of pilots. And so what the practices that we've selected are enhanced humanitarian development collaboration, which I didn't actually speak about just now, but this is something that we speak about all the time, but that we don't actually have a lot of good examples of in practice. And then the second practice is expanded market monitoring, which I will talk about now. I'll give an example of what we're doing. And the pilots, we're doing them in collaboration with Mercy Corps and CRS in Uganda, Niger, and Nigeria. So I'll talk quickly about the pilot in Niger on expanded market monitoring. So the idea here is that market monitoring is something that most agencies do when they're doing some sort of cash programming. So it's something that's a routine part of their activities anyway. And potentially we could add some indicators to market monitoring schemes beyond just price data to gain a more comprehensive picture of what's happening in markets during program implementation. So this should be relatively light for staff because it's just adding slightly to what they're doing already without demanding their time for 2 or 3 weeks straight for a heavier assessment. It also engages field staff because it's something that they're doing already. So they should be able to connect the relevance of the data with their work. And then potentially, depending on the data that you gather and how well you analyze it, you could reduce or avoid the need for a more comprehensive market assessment by having an ongoing picture of what's happening in markets. So if you had another crisis, based on the information that you have and the more frequent interaction with markets, you may not need to do a 2-week assessment. Of course, the challenges are adapting widespread practices so people have their ways of doing market monitoring. Can you really step in and change that systematically? And then, of course, which data points should be included? You don't want to make this a really heavy burden. You want to focus on the things that are really vital. And we don't have a lot of good guidance on that to date. So though our focus was initially on gaining a big sense of market dynamics overall, when we actually brought this to the field, of course, things don't usually pan out exactly the way you conceived them in the office. And the field staff who participated in the workshop initially focused on improving their current practice. And that manifested the first couple of indicators that they wanted to collect were around the quality of the data that they had been gathering. The first issue was about quality issues of products that vendors were providing in their shops. So we ended up including some data, some indicators on that in the monitoring framework. Another issue was around currency, and this was a pure data quality issue that traders in this region of Niger, which was near the border with Nigeria, they were sometimes dealing in franc CFA, and they were sometimes dealing in Naira. So we just added a question in the monitoring form that asked them about what currency they were referring to, so that the data actually meant something. And then the other indicators added were more about the big picture that I was talking about earlier. So talking about the availability of key goods, the origin of staple foods, the presence of in-kind food assistance in markets, and the cost of accessing markets for beneficiary households. So if you think about it, it's fairly easy to see how this data could contribute to program decisions. So for example, if the cost of accessing markets for beneficiary households is going up, then you might reevaluate either the value of the transfer that you're providing to households or you know, the continued relevance of cash as the preferred modality. You know, if the cost went way up, you might consider switching to in-kind. So that's just one example. So unfortunately, I would say we haven't gathered enough information from the field team to be able to say this practice has really improved our adaptive management or has really cut down on the need to do heavy assessments in the future. But just a few reflections before I close. I think the opportunity to revisit market monitoring can make improvements to how we do it is really valuable and something that's rarely done. So in terms of the systems of how we gather the information, how we coordinate our information, we really improved a mobile monitoring form during this exercise, so that made the whole process more efficient. It also gives you a chance to review your data quality and make sure the data you're gathering is good data. So that wasn't actually an aim of the exercise, but it was really valuable. Staff were very familiar with market monitoring, and so they had a lot to contribute. And I think they had a lot to contribute in a way that they sometimes don't during market assessments because they feel a bit intimidated by the concepts being presented. So it made the idea of market data and using market information for programming really tangible for them. So that was really valuable, and that was very much along the lines of what we were hoping for. And then a third reflection is that while prices are a really good indicator of, you know, changes in markets over time, adding other indicators can help you identify, adding other indicators can help you assess why prices might be changing so that you don't have to then go back and do additional analysis to figure out why prices are changing. So if you can identify key issues that may change over time, this expanded market monitoring approach could potentially save you time. So without any further ado, I will hand over. Oh, sorry. Just some questions to think about because we may have some time for discussion at the end. So what market-related data have your agency's teams monitored, aside from food prices, if any? And then what kind of decisions have your agency's teams made based on market monitoring data, whether prices or otherwise? So now I will hand over back over to William.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. That was really interesting, taking us from you know, concrete lessons learned and then seeing how you apply them in practice. And I'm excited to hear about people's examples of monitoring practices afterwards. Actually, it would be great if, you know, just as we go, if anybody can share examples of other market-related data that they've used, just maybe in the chat box. That'd be great to see. Hannah, I see that you had a question. Would you like to go ahead? Maybe she didn't. Okay. All right, then I'm going to hand over to William, and then he is going to then co-present with Simanga from World Vision. I'm really sorry that I mistakenly said was from CRS earlier on. So over to you, William.
Thank you very much, Isabel. So it's William again. Very shortly, and I will hand over to Sivanda and Bele after from World Vision. Yes, we wanted to present quickly on a paper we published recently in July, thanks to the Top Small grant, with this Top Small grant funding, on multimodal response, and the paper is called Cash or In Kind, Why Not Both? Response analysis lessons from multimodal programming. And if you want the full paper, you can see the link in the bottom, and you can go on Cash Learning on the CALP website to find the paper. But the research review lessons learns about response analysis from multimodal response, which means it's when the practitioners determine that more than one response modality between cash, voucher, and in-kind was the best fit, or when the best fit changed over the course of the project. And we compare the reasons for choosing different type of response within the same project. The idea of this paper is not necessarily to be like a technical paper or operational tool to decide about which multiple response would be appropriate for your context, but try to see what plays into the analysis for the decision maker and how to articulate the nexus between the emergency context and response with concrete example of response analysis. So we did a couple of case studies that includes with the Canadian Red Cross in Canada, World Vision in South Sudan, and they were present right after this short introduction. CRS and its partner in Guatemala and Nepal, the Red Cross movement in Nepal, Samaritan Purse in DRC, and Oxfam in Myanmar. And the general conclusion from this multiple case are an analysis of multimodal programming expect that there may be often multiple right response to a given context. So you can probably use cash, voucher, in kind at the same time depending on the context, and some of it or all of them at different time depending on the context. Also that the general information categories needed for the response analysis are quite similar across sectors, suggesting that a harmonized approach to a response analysis would be appropriate. And I think that's Emily from IRC illustrated that a few minutes ago when she mentioned the market assessment and with logistic departments, for example. I think it was interesting, and that's what we are talking about here, this kind of example. Also, the case studies did not demonstrate that financial cost savings were a major decision-making factor for choosing between cash, voucher, or in-kind assistance. Instead, the most influential argument in deciding a given modality mix included the time to delivery, the organizational capacity, the market supply response capacity, security, and beneficiary preference. So that's very interesting to see that our response, multiple response, are not necessarily exclusively driven by cost effectiveness. I think that's a good sign, of how we assess markets and needs and the complexity of it, and how we address this complexity in our response. Also, the respondent felt the human resources cost of preparing or maintaining multiple pipelines for more or less simultaneous delivery was high. So that suggests that it may not be reasonable to have simultaneous distribution of multiple types of goods and services, particularly at the beginning of the project. On the other hand, we see that switching modality once multiple pipelines and products are established is relatively straightforward. So, yeah, it was a challenge according to our respondent, and it could be a barrier potentially to have multiple pipelines. Initially, that's what they raised as an issue. However, like switching later seems easier. And finally, careful assessment and validation, slow progressive change, and well-communicated contingency planning contribute to trust and change acceptance for the use of multiple modality in the response. So engaging stakeholders in rigorous situation and response analysis contributes to acceptance and trust. It's particularly important in volatile and sensitive context. So without further ado, I think we'll see an example now from World Vision in South Sudan. Simanga and Debele were present.
Thank you, William. If I can just ask the presenters to keep keep brief and just because we've not got that much time left for the next couple of presentations. But really looking forward to hearing about this example from South Sudan. So over to you, Gift and Simanda.
Thank you very much. We will make a presentation on the multimodal approach to programming, which is basically a case study of the Juba POC. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, the major decision was to decide whether it's cash-based transfers or in-kind. But before we get into that, I will just give you a highlight of the area, of the operational area that we are operating in. Yeah. Basically, this is a location for the protection of civilians that have come in there as a result of conflict. And we usually call it the POC, protection of civilians. And currently it has 31,000 internally displaced persons, and is located in the outskirts of Juba town. Basically, what happens there is that all the services are provided by different humanitarian organizations, of which World Vision, with support from WFP, has the mandate to provide food security to all the IDPs that are resident there. So World Vision is doing through provision of food in kind and value vouchers on a monthly basis.
You can move it yourself, Gift, but I'll do it like.
Oh, okay.
It's the arrows at the bottom left.
Okay. So basically, the operation was initially all food in kind. After we were basically giving food in kind, but after the situation in Juba stabilized, market assessments were then done in consultation with the donor. The main purpose was to see whether it was possible to move on to cash programming. When that decision was made, the community was further engaged on the cash-based modality and asked on what their preferences were, what their opinions were like. And the best option as a result of that consultation was to do a combination of in-kind and value-based restricted vouchers. Now, the enablers to this process were mainly, one of them was appropriateness. We wanted to design a project that would really kind of meet the needs of the IDPs. You will recall that within kind there were a lot of complaints, mainly about the composition of the basket, lack of variety. So we thought that bringing in the other modality would assist. Now, also post-distribution monitoring findings indicated that some of the food was being sold out because of the modality that we were using. So we also undertook a feasibility assessment, which was done, and the results indicated that markets were functional and commodities available and were reaching the POC, and trading was already taking place inside the camp. World Vision also had the expertise and the technical staff were available to be able to manage a cash transfer program within that particular context. Also, one of the challenges that we were facing was that WFP, due to pipeline breaks, had logistical challenges. Sometimes food was partially provided or totally failed in terms of the provision. So a cash-based modality would make it easier, because vouchers are ordinarily easier to deliver and to administer. One of the biggest wins with this kind of modality was a diversified food basket. You'd appreciate that in kind, the basket remains the same. There are no options. People do not have that kind of option to choose the kind of food that they had. But the biggest win here was that people were able to diversify their diet in terms of the things that they could choose to buy with that. So from the in-kind modality, now with bringing in this one, we had 9 additional foods to the basket. that they could choose from. Also, there was great stimulation of the local market. You know, when you bring in cash into that particular space, like a camp, it means traders were able to grow their businesses, and the generality of the market was stimulated, because traders were getting collectively about 235 USD equivalent per month. So it means that the market was able to be stimulated, and obviously cash comes as a multiplier effect. Vouchers created employment and benefited extended family members of the traders. So it means that the traders were able to maybe pay for other needs that they ordinarily would have because of the multiplier effect of the introduction of cash. And also the reduction of in-kind meant less logistical challenges for the donor. You can imagine the POC on a month-on basis, we were moving something like 600 metric tons. So when you bring in this other component of the cash, it means that there's a logistical reduction in terms of the tonnage that you are able to move, and then consequently there's reduced pipeline challenges. Now, if you look at the next slide, we are talking about switching back to in-kind, the triggers. At design, because of the fragile complexity of the area that we operate in, which is South Sudan, we always made a provision that as part of the contingency, there would be a plan should things change to move to 100% in kind. And it's one of the things that we would recommend if you are designing a project in a fragile context, to be able to move back to what works at that particular time. There were two things that we looked at. It was the unpredictable political landscape in Juba. In this kind of context, anything is possible anytime, and it can happen anytime and anywhere. So while we were designing, we kept that in mind. But it was also becoming apparently clear that the economic situation continued to deteriorate. Inflation was creeping in, and there were signs that this could worsen to very high levels. But the triggering point was the July 2016 conflict, which was the final trigger. The markets were disrupted, so was the supply of commodities into Juba. The July 2016 conflict was a kind of an internal conflict where markets were disrupted, the routes were closed up because of that those 5 days of war. So we had to revert back, and as a result of that, a decision was taken together with the donor and the beneficiaries that the vouchers be suspended, and we move back to 100% in kind. But I think the greatest strength there was that we had that provision within the design, in that we had an agreement already with the donor that should anything happen or should there be changes within the markets, then we would be able to switch to in kind. And one of the strengths that we had the capacity to switch. World Vision had been programming in kind assistance for quite a while, so the shift from cash to in kind did not really present challenges. And we already had the infrastructure in place because we anticipated that there could be that challenges. So the rappels were there, even though they were not adequate, but they were there in case we changed, so that we could be able to store the in-kind distribution. Because of the dysfunctional markets within the IDPs, within the camps, it became apparently clear to the IDPs that the voucher component could no longer continue, and there was general acceptance and consensus in terms of drifting back to the in-kind composition. But like any other switch or shift, we had our own challenges. The availability of commodities had its own challenges. The warehouses in Juba had been looted. Over 4,000 metric tons looted during the crisis. So there were challenges in getting the commodities for us to go back to in-kind. Even the storage capacity within the camp, we did not have enough storage capacity within the camp in order to accommodate that switch. There were other challenges like access, security, and all those kind of things that affected the switch. But there were key lessons that I want to share in closing that we learned. One of them is that in a fragile context, it's always best to have a mix of modalities if this is appropriate and effective, just in case one works and the other does not work. Because in a fragile context, anything is possible. The situation may be normal today, but tomorrow definitely change. Also, programming in a fragile context requires serious contingency planning, and the individuals involved should have the general idea of how to operationalize the plan. In some instances, we have seen where a contingency plan is in place, but people fail to operationalize it in the event of a crisis. One of the key things that we have learned, especially dealing with camps and IDPs, that community engagement is very critical and very important. Because of the nature of the individuals and the beneficiaries that we deal with, it's important that they are consulted at every stage. This is why switching back was not so difficult, because the community had been part of the design in the first place. One of the key things that we also learned was flexibility is key in terms of changes in the socio-economic sphere. The vouchers were pegged in US dollars and then converted to local currency. This was because we appreciated the issues to do with inflation, issues to do with all those kind of things, the economic scenario that you find in a fragile context like Juba. So pegging everything in US dollars ensured that the value remained the same. So basically, that's the kind of experience that we thought we would share from Juba and
Thank
South
you so much, Giftem Timanga. It's a
much.
really fascinating example of the flexibility and resilience you have to show in challenging situations like this. So really very helpful. In interest of time, I'm going to hand straight over to Alison, who's going to talk to us about designing market-based early recovery programs in Northeast Nigeria. And then we'll have a little bit of space for discussion at the end. Thank you. Alison, are you there?
Alison, this is Rose. Can you write in the chat box if you're having some issues? Your microphone should be green. On the top toolbar, it goes meeting layouts audio, and then a small green speaker and a small green microphone.
Hey there, everybody.
Hi, Alison.
Great. Sorry, my microphone was frozen on the platform. Didn't like me there for a second. Okay, I will try to keep this brief, recognizing that we don't have too much time left. So this webinar has significantly focused on thinking about switching between modalities of in-kind and cash assistance. And as Isabel hinted, what we're focused on now is looking at how we can work through market actors and strengthen market systems for the purpose of recovery, but also recognizing that recovery is something that the individuals we're trying to help are going through on an ongoing basis. So we're trying to take this sort of looking beyond immediately the humanitarian aid. How can also humanitarian programs bring in this market support type of intervention? So we did an assessment in Northeast Nigeria that was focused on market recovery, and it was across 6 agencies: ACF, COPI, PRS, IRC, Mercy Corps, and Oxfam. And we wanted to look at key market systems that individuals relied on for their economic opportunities and livelihoods. So we focused on cereals, it should actually say pulses here, vegetables, and inputs. And so, as I said, we were actually trying to get to non-traditional interventions. So we're trying to go beyond cash versus in-kind, but also look at what could be complementary types of interventions that could involve maybe things like partnerships with actors in the market system. And then the final thing is that the assessment process we've gone through, and the final report is just about to be published, has been an iterative assessment process, and so it involved both quantitative and qualitative data collection, as well as a response options workshop. So what I'm going to focus on is the response options portion, and so the question that we put to ourselves is, how do we come up with different types of response options that make us think a little bit more towards how we can be strengthening the role of market actors while also ensuring that we're supporting recovery for households. So why a market systems approach? We hear this word floating around in our sector, and you know, what does it really mean? The thinking behind this is if we work through the actors in the market systems, whether or not those be, you know, traders or associations or local governments or transporters, we can actually trigger long-term recovery. We can understand how the full market system works in order to prevent us doing harm. That's something that Emily was talking about earlier. We can also see that maybe we have a potential for broader impact because we can actually reach scale when we work through partners who are integrated in market systems. And we can support people to use markets for economic coping, recognizing that actually more beyond what we do as humanitarians, it's those market actors that are actually those traders and the relationships that people have locally are typically the primary place that people go to cope in crisis. So some examples to make that a little bit more tangible and less theoretical. And this is the process, by the way, that we went through with the Nigeria assessment. We sat down with everyone at the kickoff workshop and we said, these are the examples of what we're trying to get to and the learning that we're trying to push forward here so that it felt concrete enough that people could identify examples in their context. So in Ethiopia, we have the example from our Prime program where in addition to cash-based assistance in a drought, we also provided subsidies and vouchers to traders in order to do commercial destocking. And basically what that meant is we were helping traders have the guarantee and the money needed to be able to help farmers get rid of their livestock that were going to suffer and get sick. So basically we're helping households protect their productive assets in a way by, while they're selling off their livestock, they're actually having more cash to spend in the drought, and then it actually means that they're not having those livestock get sick and die. An example from Liberia, post-Ebola, and this is a lesson learned. We wanted to do an input voucher program to work with to make sure that households could access inputs for the growing season. However, when we worked with large businesses, we risked undermining the longer run local input networks that were maybe weak and fragile, but those small businesses were critical for economic recovery and were typically the places that people went to buy input. So when we brought in large businesses, that actually created a problem for the local economy in the way it was before. So even when you work through market actors, sometimes you can do it in ways that aren't so helpful. And then another learning example. In Syria, we were able to increase our reach, and I think a lot of organizations have taken on this model, by delivering flour to bakeries instead of delivering bread directly to households. The beneficiary numbers on this program were something like 100,000 people per day. Problem is, we didn't go far enough. We stayed with that model, and Emily was talking about adaptive management earlier. What we should have done is actually then recognize that over time we could actually work on strengthening our relationships with mills and with farmers to make sure that we were still growing and had the inputs that the bakeries needed. So we were actually intervening in a way in the end in the market that was still undercutting it in ways that it had the potential to function. So coming back to Nigeria, what was the process we went through for response options? We reviewed the findings from the assessment. We took a look at the market systems approach. We did a brief training at the kickoff workshop and did a little bit of a refresher at the end. We did a review of the key constraints that we identified in the assessment and the key actors in the market system that we could potentially work with as partners. And then we used that to guide ideas generation and sharing. And we made it a very sort of think big picture, be creative, there's no bad idea because we're just trying to get at potential options, and then we can whittle it down from there. So just to make this concrete, what did we identify? The key constraints we saw across those 4 market systems, those agricultural market systems. We saw restricted movement. We saw limited access to inputs and related services, and limited access to finance and capital. Who are the key actors that were involved? We had aggregators and buyers, traders, finance agents, transporters, input suppliers, processors, associations like Traders and Transporters Associations, government, community leaders and groups, and the producers. So then we gave everybody a matrix to fill in. And you'll notice that this is similar to maybe a response option matrix that you might see might have seen in other contexts or on other assessments. But what we really tried to do was focus on what is the constraint we're addressing, and then what are the roles of actors involved. So you can see here, I won't read them all, but here are the questions that we ask, that we put in front of everyone to do our brainstorm activity. So you can see the question, who are the actors involved? What are the barriers to achieving our goals? So for our target group, but also for the other actors that those target groups rely on, such as your input suppliers, your traders. And so then who can we engage with, and what would we do with these actors? Trying to get to the idea of could we have partnerships maybe with some of these other actors rather than just delivering services directly ourselves. We also took on some tools that come from, actually from market systems development, but have applications in this context. And here's a tool that comes out of market systems development. It's called the Who Does, Who Pays matrix. So we look at what are we doing now, who's paying for a service now, and who's doing it now, and who do we want to be doing it in the future. It helps you think about sustainability. So if we're providing a service now, or if donors are paying for something now, how can we think about what we want that to look like in the future? Which actors do we think we want to be involved? Is that a role for traders? Is that a role for informal financiers? How can we work with these different actors? Okay, so what did we come up with? This is just an example, by the way. There are lots of other response options. We have some more traditional responses, such as cash for work to rehabilitate roads or market infrastructure. Sorry for my typo. Cash to traders to rebuild and restock. That's becoming an increasingly common market support intervention. We also had some other ideas, like linking input suppliers to new sources of improved input. And this is, still possible in a recovery timeframe, or working with financial institutions to improve the credit availability or the options for traders. You can see how we sort of are blurring those lines between what we would think of as the development interventions and humanitarian interventions. And recognizing that that's not because we're doing development work, but we're actually trying to take some of those principles and think about what they mean for recovery. Lessons that we learned. Obviously, doing things differently is hard. We had a diverse background of humanitarians and developments in the room, something that Emily touched on earlier. But we recognize that actually having those different perspectives can help you come up with new and creative ideas. Having those example interventions help. But overall, we really just needed more time, both to dig into and understand the findings, and more time to think about really what do interventions that look differently, that work with these market actors and partner with them in new ways, what do they look like? That needed more time. We also recognize that sometimes the most creative ideas are actually identified during data collection, and this process happened later during a workshop. So actually getting those sort of popcorn ideas from enumerators during an assessment can be really helpful for grounding some creative ideas. Also, we recognize that this is only a starting point. So really, in order to make these things tangible and concrete, it actually involves going out and then having deeper conversations with potential partners. So we've got 1 minute left. And with that, I will hand it back over.
Thank you so much, Alison. It's very hard to try and summarize the richness of what we've heard from all of you in a minute. But just one thing that really struck me that linked both your presentation and the previous one on the Juba example is the need to, or the value in involving market actors in the decision-making process and in ongoing response analysis throughout. It seemed like that allowed the flexibility between modality and in Juba, and in your case, through this response options process, it facilitated a broader set of options being put on the table. So I think that's really interesting to hear. I would maybe it'd be just interesting to hear, Francesca, you said you had an example to share. Please do. I think if we can have a couple of minutes of another example, and then anybody else who wants to make a contribution, we'll aim to finish in 5 minutes. Please raise your hand if you'd like to make another contribution. So over to you, Francesca.
Okay, great. I've just tried to turn on my speaker. Is that working?
Yes.
Hello? Okay, great. So I'll be very brief, but just to say we had a very similar trajectory in South Kivu with WFP and UNHCR. I think at the time WFP logistics were just a lot less flexible, and that was the major constraint. But essentially what happened was we got start DFID money to start the response for new refugees in the camp in Lusenda in South Kivu. We were prepared to do a market-based approach, and the problem for WFP is literally just that their pipeline had already started, and it was like they couldn't turn back the trucks or turn back the system. At the same time, there were problems because they were distributing a type of commodity, a type of cornmeal that beneficiaries really didn't like. So beneficiaries were just selling it or trying to get other stuff. So the compromise we made is we made a voucher system with local markets for people to get dried fish, sugar and oil as kind of a top-up. So we kind of started that in the startup phase of the camp. And then WFP eventually transitioned to a voucher-based system. And I believe they're actually piloting a cash-based system with a new service provided by one of the banks. So telecoms are quite weak, but there's a kind of electronic platform supported by one of the banks that they're just piloting. So I would be surprised if they could scale up. So what I'm really impressed with the Juba example is how flexible their contingency plans are. And it looks like that's what the context really requires. But just to say that we had a similar scenario in South Kivu, and I think things are going in the same direction. It's just it was a bit slower getting off the ground. That's all for me.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think that it's great to see that in a way organizations are learning, from these experiences, and I think that whilst we're far from being all being in a situation where flexibility between modalities is the norm, that is at least increasing.
And maybe I could just add, we were actually doing vouchers for NFIs, and this was literally because there was a UNHCR rupture, like their pipeline was just stuck somewhere. So we did a bunch of the initial NFIs just through a voucher system with local markets.
And sometimes it's blockers like that create innovation and change. Are there any other examples to share, Sarah or Marie? You're welcome to share orally if you'd like.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I wanted to say, well, I was hearing what Francisca was reporting about the challenges in DRC, and that makes me think that there are some examples in the multimodal approach publication about the challenges and the flexible approach that was adopted by Samaritan's Purse and CRS in DRC in a context of how it's called, the contingency plan, actually, when they have funds from USAID to intervene in where there is an influx of refugees, of IDPs, so they don't know where they're going to intervene, and so it means it's very hard to plan for cash or in kind, and therefore it requires flexibility. There are two interesting case studies. Well, actually, we made it into one.
Thanks, Marie. And I can see Sarah there is highlighting a new report. Oh, great, to talk about humanitarian and market systems teams working together. Well, unless there are any specific contributions to make, I'm conscious that I don't want to run over too much, but clearly this has been a really rich discussion, and we'll reflect on how we can keep this discussion live. I mean, obviously the Markets in Crisis D group is a great forum for that, and I'm sure that the speakers would be happy for you to reach out to them with further questions and reflections. We'll share the recording of the webinar both on the Markets in Crisis D group and on the CALP D group, and hopefully that will stimulate some discussions too. Maybe I'll put some of these questions in the message so that we can continue this discussion offline. So I really want to say thank you so much to all the presenters and for them putting up with our initial technological challenges and then a couple of glitches this time as well, but really appreciate all your insights. And thanks to all our participants for staying till the very end and for your engagement.
Thanks everyone. I will end the recording now.
Thank you.